Some truths are not buried by time but by mercy. It begins with a pale envelope, unsigned, scentless, and bearing a pressed white rose that should not have survived the sea. In this quiet tale of justice unsought and silence kept, Holmes receives an answer to a question never spoken aloud. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. Now, draw closer to the fog-veiled edge of Baker Street. For this is a case that ended not in court but in ash. It was upon a chill and unhurried morning in late September that I found myself once again beside the fire at 221B Baker Street, observing with quiet satisfaction the rhythmic tapping of raindrops against the tall windows. London, that sprawling and sullen organism of gaslight and chimney smoke, seemed subdued beneath the greyness of the hour. Holmes had taken to his chair with the immobility of a statue, his long, pale fingers steepled beneath his chin, and his eyes half closed. Not in slumber, but in that peculiar state of concentration which often heralded the beginning of some strange new case. The room was as it ever was, cluttered with newspapers and monographs, the scent of tobacco blending with the faint aroma of damp wool from our coats. Outside, the passing of a cab's wheels on wet stone echoed like the memory of a dream. It was, I thought, the sort of morning that arrives only in London, where time seems to hold its breath, and something, whether dread or revelation, lurks just beneath the day's surface. Mrs. Hudson brought in the post with her usual silent efficiency, and among the circulars and medical journals was a single envelope, unadorned, slightly crumpled at the corners, and marked in a hand I did not at first recognize. Holmes opened his eyes and extended a hand before I could speak. He turned the envelope over with mild interest. "From Colonel James Darnley," he remarked, "of Surrey. We encountered him once in the matter of the Shropshire forgeries. A man of some rigidity and considerable pride. The seal had been applied in haste, and the ink on the address was faintly smudged, as though written in poor light or unsteady fingers." Holmes slit it open with the blade he kept tucked beneath the mantel clock, and unfolded the single sheet within. A faint scent of wood smoke clung to the paper. Odd, I thought, for correspondence scarcely a day old. Holmes read aloud, slowly and without commentary. "Mr. Holmes, I write not to demand your assistance, but to confess my folly. I fear that a decision made too late has become a danger that no longer waits. I have no right to your time. Nevertheless, should anything occur, I trust you to read beneath the obvious." He looked up, his grey eyes unreadable. "That is all," he said. "No name? No request? Nothing more?" I asked, reaching for the note as he passed it to me. The handwriting was even, though pressed hard than clarity. The phrasing was curious, tinged with remorse, and yet not without purpose. I had seen Holmes toss aside longer letters with a flick of disdain, but this one he regarded for some time, his thumb brushing along its edge. "There is something almost theatrical in the restraint," Holmes murmured. "Darnley is not a man prone to sentiment. That he should write at all, and in such terms, suggests he is both ashamed and afraid. But why not request your help directly? Because he does not wish to admit, even to himself, the nature of the danger," Holmes replied. "He hints without revealing, warns without declaring. That kind of silence is not indifference, Watson. It is dread." He rose and crossed to the window, lifting the edge of the curtain. The rain continued its soft descent upon the street below. "And yet," he said, after a pause, "he has planted the seed. He has, in effect, unburdened himself in the hope that he need not say more. A man does not write such a letter unless he knows something is coming, but believes it already too late to avert it." I was about to inquire further when the rustling of newsprint at my elbow drew my attention elsewhere. That evening, as the rain faded to mist and the gas lamps took on their familiar halo. I turned through the Evening Standard, more from habit than interest. Holmes was in his armchair once again, but no longer in repose. Instead, he had taken to scraping the edge of his violin bow with deliberate slowness, a habit I had learned to interpret as the outward sign of inward restlessness. I was halfway down the third column of the front page when a name arrested my eye. Hartwood House, in Surrey, I said aloud. Destroyed by fire last night. Holmes stilled. I read on. The ancestral seat of Colonel James Darnley was consumed in a blaze shortly after midnight. The house, which had hosted the wedding celebration of Colonel Darnley's only daughter, Miss Eleanor Darnley, earlier that day, was entirely lost. One body, as yet unidentified, has been recovered from the study. Miss Darnley has not been accounted for. There was more. Speculation about the origin of the fire, a statement from the local magistrate. But I stopped reading when I saw Holmes's face. He had not moved. The bow lay idle in his hand, and his gaze was fixed, not upon me, but on the column of smoke that no doubt still rose above the ashes of Hartwood House. Holmes rose and took the paper from my hands without a word. He read the passage once, then again, and folded it with extraordinary care before laying it upon the mantel. He said nothing for several minutes. Then, softly, "There is nothing accidental about this, Watson. You believe the fire was deliberate." "I believe," he said, "that Colonel Darnley knew what was coming, and that he attempted to conceal it behind silence and civility. A bride vanishes on her wedding night. A house is reduced to rubble. An unnamed corpse in the study, and all of it foreshadowed by a single letter." He turned to me then, with that particular brightness in his eye which I had come to know, though never welcome, as the mark of impending departure. "Pack a small case," he said. "We leave for Surrey at dawn." And with that, he turned back to the fireplace and resumed his quiet study of the smoke. We departed Baker Street before the fog had fully lifted, with Holmes in one of his more taciturn moods, and I content to observe the landscape slowly shifting beyond the carriage window. The train bore us southward through the wet fields of Surrey, the trees lean with rain, and the earth freshly disturbed by early ploughs. The countryside wore a soiled veil of ash-grey light, and I could not help but feel that we were being conveyed, not toward a rural idyll, but rather into the charred wake of something irretrievable. Holmes had said little since we left London. He had declined both breakfast and the Times, and sat opposite me now with his eyes half shuttered, fingertips pressed together, and his chin resting lightly upon them. Only once did he speak, and then with an absent air, as though following some inner thread. "There is a difference, Watson, between what is lost and what has been made to disappear. The former is an accident, the latter is an intention." We arrived at Hartwood shortly after 10. What met us was not the grandeur of a country estate, but the wreckage of a home that had, within a single night, become a relic. The fire had left little intact. Blackened timbers jutted skyward like the ribs of a shipwreck. One wing of the house had collapsed entirely, and a low mist hung about the stove, overwhelming, a mingling of soot and scorched plaster that clung to the breath and settled in the bones. Local constables moved quietly among the ruins, their boots crunching over splintered debris, while villagers stood behind a makeshift cordon, whispering with morbid reverence. A thin drizzle had begun to fall again, though the ground was already sodden. Beside me, Holmes surveyed the devastation with a gaze that lingered not on the ruin itself, but on what remained unscathed. A young constable with ash on his collar led us through what had once been the main corridor, and now existed only as a skeletal hallway of half-collapsed beams. In the remains of the study, still partially roofed, they had found a body. The corpse had been recovered early that morning, we were told, curled beside a broken escritoire and badly charred. The fire had consumed the face entirely, and the clothing had been burned to such an extent that identification was, at present, impossible. Only a pocket watch, melted along one edge, and a pair of scorched cufflinks had been preserved. "No papers," the constable added. "No wallet. Nothing to name in. But not Colonel Darnley. He's alive, sir, though injured, upstairs. And the bride, Miss Darnley, she's not yet found." Holmes nodded, his gaze passing slowly over the scorched floorboards. He did not approach the corpse, but crouched instead beside the soot-blackened hearth, where the faintest trace of footprints had survived amid the ruin. We were shown to the rear parlour, where Captain Geoffrey Langton sat with his right hand bound in linen, and a line of bruises darkening one cheek. He was a man of excellent bearing, tall, fair, with a soldier's posture, and the weary demeanour of one who had slept little and spoken too often. He rose when we entered, but declined Holmes's hand, gesturing instead to the empty chairs beside him. His voice when he spoke was clipped and formal. "It all happened so quickly," he said. "One moment we were toasting in the drawing room. The next there was smoke, confusion. Someone shouting that the south wing had caught. Eleanor vanished during the panic. I believed she'd gone with her father, but then he emerged alone, injured. No one saw her after the fire began." Holmes said nothing, his expression unreadable. Langton's fingers moved nervously against his bandaged palm, and I thought I saw something restrained in his tone. Not grief, but calculation. There are certain manners of speech that the trained physician learns to notice, not by what is said, but by how it is withheld. As Langton recounted the events of the evening, I found myself struck by the absence of Eleanor's name in his speech. He referred to her as the bride, or Darnley's daughter, but never as my wife. Holmes, for his part, allowed the silence to speak where words did not. His eyes never left Langton's face, though his hands rested idly on his cane. The captain met his gaze, but with the guarded steadiness of a man rehearsing a narrative rather than recalling it. "She was wearing white," Langton said at last, as if prompted by memory. "A silver ribbon at her waist. No cloak." Holmes tilted his head slightly. "And you did not see her again?" "No." The reply came too quickly. We walked the grounds in silence after our interview. The rain had abated, leaving the soil damp and the air heavy. Holmes traced the perimeter of the house with his usual measured pace, pausing now and again to study a scorched beam or examine the pattern of footprints in the softened mud. Near the rose garden, miraculously untouched by the blaze, Holmes stopped. Upon the hedge that bordered the stone path was draped a piece of delicate white fabric, fluttering slightly in the breeze. He stepped forward and lifted it carefully. "A veil," he said quietly, "of lace and pearl thread, untouched by fire, not dropped in haste, but placed." I took it from him and turned it over in my hands. The embroidery was fine, the stitching unfrayed. It bore no smoke damage, no scent of ash. "She came here," Holmes murmured. "And not in flight." Beneath the hedge, Holmes knelt and studied the soil. The prints were faint, delicate, barely impressions at all, but unmistakable in their direction. They led away from the ruins, not towards safety, but into the copse that bordered the estate. "These are not the steps of panic," he said. "There is no irregularity of stride, no sign of stumbling or haste." She walked with deliberation. Oneself from it beforehand is quite another. Holmes straightened, brushing dirt from his sleeve. "She was never in the blaze," he said, "nor was she carried away from it. We stood at the edge of the property, where the trees gathered like silent sentinels. The branches swayed gently overhead, casting slender shadows across the path, and for a long moment Holmes said nothing. He stared into the wood, with the stillness I had come to recognize. Not hesitation, but calculation. Then, almost to himself, he said, "She was not taken by fire, my dear fellow. She walked into silence." The words hung between us like breath on winter air. And with that, Holmes turned and began the long walk back toward the ruins of Hartwood House, where smoke still lingered in the stone. The morning after our arrival, we returned to the blackened shell of Hartwood to speak with the remaining servants, those who had not been dismissed or evacuated in the confusion following the blaze. Among them were a parlour-maid by the name of Tess Compton and a young footman whose surname, curiously, no one seemed to recall. Both had been present throughout the reception and had remained late into the evening before the fire began. Tess, a girl with nervous fingers and eyes that darted often toward the ruined chimneys, described the mood at the supper as odd-like. There had been tension, she said, especially among the guests near the head of the table. She had seen Miss Darnley speak quietly with her father, not her new husband, and afterward return to the garden with her gloves still in her hand. The footman added, with some reluctance, that there had been a dispute earlier that afternoon, a raised voice, muffled by closed doors, somewhere in the east wing. But no one had dared inquire. It was the housemaid Lillian Marsh who provided the most curious observation of the morning. A plain, soft-spoken girl of perhaps 19, she approached us with the hesitant air of one burdened by something she had not meant to carry. "I saw her," she said, eyes fixed upon her apron hem. "Miss Eleanor. Or, well, she was wearing the white dress and the veil. I saw her walking out through the garden gate before the smoke rose." Holmes's posture sharpened at once. "Before?" Lillian nodded. "It was just after sunset. I was in the conservatory, cleaning glass. She walked slow, like she weren't in no hurry, and she didn't look back." "Did she appear distressed?" "No, sir," the girl whispered. "She looked finished." That's the word I'd use. Holmes thanked her gravely and remained still for a long moment, as though he were listening not to the testimony, but to something more distant, something yet unspoken. We found Captain Langton again in the ruined study, standing before the fire-blackened hearth, his arms folded tightly across his chest. Holmes entered with the quiet authority that often preceded his more delicate inquiries. "I wonder, Captain," he said lightly, "whether your bride ever expressed a desire to travel, abroad perhaps?" Langton's eyes narrowed. "What are you implying, Mr. Holmes?" "Only that she may have taken her leave of the house before the fire, and by her own volition." Langton's voice hardened. "That's preposterous. She would never have left without informing me." Holmes said nothing. He merely studied Langton's knuckles, which were raw at the edges, and the way his right thumb pressed tightly against the bandage on his hand. There was in Langton's voice no surprise, only annoyance. "You will find," he added coolly, "that grief does not always make a man eloquent." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "No, but it often reveals what silence conceals." Holmes requested to examine the remainder of the house, and we were led through the eastern wing, where the fire had curiously spared a narrow corridor of servants' rooms and a small pantry that opened toward the rear stair. The scent here was different. Less of smoke, more of oil and damp paper. The ceiling bore no charring, and the floor was unmarked by fire. Holmes paused beside a stack of scorched storage crates and knelt. He placed his gloved hand to the stone floor, and then raised it to his nose. Lamp oil, he murmured. But no fire reached this place. A row of empty bottles stood upright on a low shelf. Holmes examined them carefully, his expression unreadable. One of them bore a residue at its lip, thick, greasy, and tinged with copper. "This room was prepared," he said softly. "Prepared and spared." "What do you mean?" He did not answer at once. Instead, he moved to a half-collapsed bureau and ran his fingers along the blackened edge of its drawer. The drawer creaked as he opened it, its joints warped from heat, brushing the ash from its surface. It depicted Miss Eleanor Darnley, younger than I had seen her in her wedding portrait, seated upon a low stone wall, beside a man I did not recognize. The man wore no uniform, but the sharpness of his profile suggested military bearing. His hand rested lightly upon Eleanor's shoulder, and though the image had faded, the smile upon her face was one I had not yet seen elsewhere. Holmes examined the back of the photograph, where no inscription had been written, then returned his gaze to the man's face. A long crack ran through the figure's chest, as though the image itself had suffered a wound. "He was known to her," Holmes said, "and likely to Langton as well." We returned to Langton once more, and this time Holmes wasted no time on preamble. He handed the photograph to the captain and stood silently as the man examined it. Langton's brow furrowed for an instant, but the expression passed so swiftly that I might have mistaken it for a flicker of light upon glass. "Curious," he said, handing it back. "But I do not know the fellow." Holmes regarded him coolly. "You do not recognize the man beside your bride?" Langton shook his head. "Some early acquaintance, no doubt. She had a life before me, Mr. Holmes. I do not presume to catalogue it." It was spoken with the kind of measured detachment that might have convinced another listener. But Holmes merely pocketed the photograph and turned to leave. "Indeed," he murmured. "Some faces are too easily forgotten, except by the dead." That evening we dined at a small inn in the village and returned to our rented rooms, where Holmes sat with his long fingers pressed once more into a steeple before him. The fire burned low. Outside, the wind stirred faintly in the shutters. "I believe," he said at last, "that the fire served not as a tool of destruction, but of concealment. You think someone intended to erase a presence?" "Precisely. Or two presences. One removed, one silenced." He rose and crossed to the window. His reflection stared back at him in the glass, shadowed, half-formed. "This was not a crime born of impulse," he continued, his voice low. "It was the work of calculation, of bitterness simmered too long. The lamp oil was laid with deliberation, the photograph hidden, not discarded. A bridal veil folded, not dropped. These are not the marks of chaos." "And the motive?" I asked. He turned slightly, just enough for the firelight to catch the edge of his cheek. "Not love, Watson," he said. "Not grief, but jealousy. That is the spark that leaves no smoke, only ashes." We had not long returned to Baker Street when Holmes resumed his study of the scorched photograph discovered in the pantry drawer of Hartwood House. He placed it carefully beneath the light of the window, the midday sky diffused with a low grey that lent the image a ghostly pallor. I watched as he turned it this way and that, his sharp gaze lingering on the features of the man seated beside Eleanor Darnley. "Felix Rees," he said at last. I started. "The name is not familiar to me." It would not be. He was believed dead, presumed lost in the skirmishes along the Tugela line during the Boer campaign. His name was printed among the casualties in the Army Gazette, but never confirmed. His body, you see, was never recovered. He said no more, but I observed the way his forefinger hovered for a moment over the man's face, half burned, but still intact enough to bear the distinctive curve of the jaw and the high-bridged nose. A face not easily forgotten. That afternoon, Holmes sent 2 telegrams from the telegraph office near Oxford Street. One addressed to a retired colonel of the Natal Light Horse, and the second to a naval clerk stationed in Dover. Both were short and encrypted in the peculiar cipher Holmes used for urgent communications. The responses arrived within 24 hours. Rees disembarked at Southampton 2 months ago under the name Edward Varden, Holmes read aloud. He gave no forwarding address, but is known to have remained in England. No military post, no pension filed. He looked up from the note. He returned, Watson, and he concealed his presence. But why? I asked. Holmes folded the telegram and tapped it once against his palm. Because the dead, when returned to life, often find themselves in possession of truths that the living cannot tolerate. There was a note of something colder in his voice then. Not cynicism precisely, but wearied recognition. Among Eleanor Darnley's surviving belongings, retrieved from a fireproof box salvaged by the housekeeper, was a collection of personal correspondence tied with blue silk. The topmost envelope bore no address, only the word his written in an elegant duty bred into me. I do not doubt your love, but I am bound by more than love. The name I carry is no longer mine alone, and the cost of severing it may be too great for us both. If you come at your peril. If I stay at my own. I do not yet know which is the greater crime. I looked up, struck by the aching restraint in her words. It was not the voice of a young woman enchanted by romance. It was the voice of someone caught between obligation and desperation. Holmes did not speak. He did not need to. The following morning, we made our way to Somerset House, where the great tomes of the civil registry were kept beneath brass lamps and dust-heavy silence. Holmes presented our inquiry with characteristic precision, requesting all entries related to Felix Rees, formerly of the Natal Light Horse. The clerk returned after some time with a ledger from which Holmes transcribed several lines into his notebook. He showed them to me as we stepped out into the thin October sunlight. Note, he said, that Rees was never officially recorded as killed. His entry reads simply, unlocated, presumed deceased. No certificate issued, no estate resolved. Then by law, I said, he could return and reclaim his name. Precisely. But he did not. He remained hidden. Holmes stared down at the pavement for a moment. And one does not hide in peacetime unless one has made an enemy of it. That evening, as we sat once more beside the hearth in Baker Street, Holmes drew out the preliminary report from the Surrey coroner regarding the body found in the Hartwood study. Burned beyond recognition, he quoted. No dental record available. Height estimated at 5 feet 10 inches. No jewellery recovered. Hands charred, but right wrist bore an old scar. Holmes tapped the edge of the page with his finger. Rees bore such a scar, bayonet wound received at Spion Kop. I remember reading it in his field report years ago. Then the man in the study was likely not some unfortunate guest. Holmes finished quietly. It was Rees.
He returned to Hartwood, perhaps to see Eleanor, perhaps to rescue her, and he died there, either by accident or design. I sat back in my chair, the firelight catching the rim of my glass. If Langton knew he was there, Holmes nodded slowly, then the blaze was more than a tragedy. It was a funeral pyre. As I turned these facts over in my mind, I found myself reflecting more deeply on the wedding itself. It had been spoken of in society pages as a union of legacy and honor. Miss Eleanor Darnley, sole heiress of Hartwood, and Captain Langton, decorated and deliberate. But what if the wedding had been something else entirely? A performance, a veil not only for the bride, but for the truth itself. I thought of the letter Eleanor had written, the voice of one trapped beneath the weight of duty. I thought of Rhys, returned not to claim love, but perhaps to shield it. And I thought of Langton, whose grief wore the expression of possession, not loss. It occurred to me then that Eleanor may never have intended to marry at all. Or rather, she had married, but not the man who stood at the altar. Holmes did not speak as he returned the scorched photograph to its envelope and placed it gently inside the black leather folio where he kept unsolved remnants of old cases. He closed it with a quiet finality, binding the ribbon and setting it upon the shelf beside the Sign of the Four and the Boscombe Valley mystery.
"She vanished once to honor love,"
he said at last,
"and again to bury its witness."
There was no triumph in his voice, only gravity and perhaps a kind of reverence. It was on the third day of our return from London that Inspector Lestrade arrived at Hartwood, bringing with him a chill wind, the scent of damp overcoat, and the comfortable certainty of official opinion. I had seen that look before in him, that of a man who believed a matter, though tragic, to be entirely concluded by the machinery of routine. "A sad business, Holmes," Lestrade announced as he stepped into what remained of the front vestibule. "Nothing criminal here, mind you. A fire, yes, but accidental by all reckoning. Unattended lamp, dry floorboards, an unfortunate sequence of chance." Holmes offered a mild bow, his expression one of practiced neutrality. "You've reviewed the reports, I take it?" "Preliminary findings, yes," Lestrade replied. "No signs—"
Pause after Lestrade concluded his report, a silence filled not with assent, but with careful observation. Holmes's eyes had shifted from the inspector's face to the narrow stairwell that led downward to the cellar ruins. The passage was blocked by half-collapsed beams and the residual scent of scorched plaster. But something in its shadowed mouth seemed to hold his attention. "You've had men search the lower floor?" Holmes asked. Lestrade nodded. "A cursory sweep. Nothing of note remains, save a few charred beams and some broken stone." "Why?" Holmes gave no reply. He merely stepped closer to the ruined stair, his gaze travelling over the ironwork banister, where soot had clung unevenly, revealing the faint outline of a gloved hand. He crouched then, not dramatically but with quiet deliberation, and laid a palm to the scorched floor. "Sometimes," he murmured, "it is the place we do not search that tells us the most." Lestrade opened his mouth, but Holmes had already disappeared below. The cellar was little more than a shell now, a hollowed tomb of damp stone, the ceiling open to the weather above. Water dripped in a steady rhythm from the beams, and the ground was thick with a layer of ash and broken laths. Holmes stepped lightly across the space, pausing now and then to study the alignment of fallen joists. His cane tapped gently along the wall's base, until it struck something hollow beneath the boards. "Watson," he called softly. "Here." Together we cleared away a section of debris, revealing a small, square trap in the floor, concealed beneath a layer of blackened slats. With a careful tug, Holmes lifted the panel to reveal a narrow recess, scarcely larger than a boot box. Inside, resting amid the soot as though untouched by the fire's rage, lay a white silk glove. It was folded delicately, and I saw at once that it bore no sign of scorching. "Why hide a glove, Watson?" Holmes said. "Unless it bore something not meant to be seen." Holmes took the glove gently into his hands and turned it over, examining the stitching along the wrist with the fastidiousness of a jeweller handling filigree. The glove was unmarked by flame, but not untouched. Faint stains of brown-black ink and softened wax marred the inner lining near the cuff. He reached into the hollow where the glove had lain and withdrew a small folded paper, tucked within the glove's interior like a secret, deliberately preserved. The parchment was creased and damp along the edges, but intact. He unfolded it with the tip of his fingers. "A message," he said, "written with deliberation, but also with urgency. See how the ink is pressed, yet not smeared." I leaned in. The handwriting was unfamiliar to me at first, curving, delicate, but interspersed with odd symbols and spaces that interrupted its flow. It looked less like a letter and more like a riddle. "Cipher?" I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. "Metaphor wrapped in cipher. An old trick when one fears the eyes of another may find it." Back at the village inn, by the light of the paraffin lamp, Holmes laid the note flat upon the desk and went to work with a quiet intensity that required no commentary from me. He consulted a small pocket-book of encoded alphabets and reversed symbols, occasionally pausing to read a line aloud in fragments. "Where ash is offered as veil, the name I wore is no longer mine. Beneath the white, another burns." Holmes tapped his pen against the third line, a substitution cipher built around metaphor. A farewell, but one not intended to reveal the author's location, only her absence. "It is from Eleanor." Undoubtedly. The meaning became clearer as Holmes filled in the lines. Each phrase shrouded in emotion more than information, yet all pointing toward one immutable fact. Eleanor had intended to vanish. The glove, the moat, the compartment. It was a staged erasure, a vanishing written not in fear, but with resolve. "He believed the fire would say what she could not," Holmes murmured, but she left behind her own version of the truth. There was no name at the end of the message, no flourish or farewell. The parchment concluded with a final line, half stricken through. "The name I leave behind was not freely given." Holmes traced his finger over the closing words and folded the paper once more. "It is her voice," I said, "the same tenor as the letter we read in London, that quiet despair, dressed in civility." Holmes nodded. A woman cornered by expectation, and yet unwilling to allow her silence to be interpreted as complicity. This was not a plea for rescue. It was the last word of someone choosing their own disappearance. I looked again at the glove. Its delicate seams were frayed now where Holmes had handled it, but its presence remained deeply unsettling. There was something eerie in its perfection, in the way it had lain, preserved and waiting. Not discarded, forgotten. Placed, Holmes returned the glove to the small table where he had placed the charred photograph of Felix Rees. The two objects, one unburnt, the other scorched, lay side by side, silent artifacts of a tragedy too carefully composed to be called mere accident. "There are two exits from this tragedy, Watson," he said softly. "One by fire and one by ink." He said no more, and for a long while neither did I. The Darnley residence, a modest cottage situated on the northern edge of the village, bore no resemblance to the once proud halls of Hartwood. Where the great house had stood as a symbol of lineage and tradition, this dwelling seemed an afterthought. Its shutters drawn, its garden left to wither beneath autumn's touch. The whitewashed walls were clean, but unwelcoming, and the silence that surrounded the place was of a kind that repelled conversation. Holmes and I were admitted by a housekeeper who spoke in a whisper and walked with the tread of someone well accustomed to grief. She led us down a narrow hall, past curtained windows and shuttered doors, until we reached a dim chamber at the rear of the house. Colonel James Darnley lay propped against two pillows in a high-backed chair, a blanket across his lap and a cane resting by his side. The room was still, shuttered against the light, yes, but also against intrusion, remembrance, and perhaps even absolution. "Mr. Holmes," the colonel said as we entered, his voice hoarse but composed. "And Dr. Watson, I presume." Holmes bowed. "We had not hoped to trouble you so soon, Colonel, but the matter at hand is concluded," the Colonel interrupted, with a trace of finality. "There is little I can say to you that has not already been said in speculation and sorrow." He motioned for us to sit. Though courteous in form, his tone bore the weight of exhaustion, not merely physical, but moral. A fatigue that seemed rooted in something older than the fire. Holmes's expression remained neutral. "You do not inquire what we have come to discuss. I have no need. You are a man who does not arrive without purpose. But if it concerns my daughter, I shall say this. I do not answer questions about things that cannot be changed." It was not evasion nor defiance. Rather, it was the resignation of a man who had paid the price of knowledge and chosen silence in place of further debt. Holmes, who had seated himself near the window, said nothing for several minutes. I attempted to bridge the quiet with some comment on the Colonel's recovery, but the old man replied in monosyllables. His hand trembled slightly as he lifted a cigarette to his lips, and his eyes flickered toward the hearth, though no fire had been lit. It was then I noticed that the brandy in the glass at his elbow remained untouched, and the cigarette, once lit, burned unnoticed between his fingers. The ash lengthened until it crumbled into his lap, unheeded. Holmes, meanwhile, observed without comment. His gaze passed from the glass to the hand, then to the cane by the Colonel's side. Not a word escaped his lips, but I knew what he was seeing, what he was always seeing. It was a silence heavy with things left unsaid, in the drawn blinds, in the stiffness of the Colonel's posture, in the room itself, which bore the atmosphere not of convalescence, but of voluntary confinement. Holmes stirred at last, his voice mild, almost conversational. "Colonel, I wonder, have you heard mention, recently, of a man named Felix Reese?" Darnley did not flinch. His eyes remained fixed on the empty hearth. "I have heard many names in my life," he said slowly. "Some I remember, others I prefer not to. But this one, Reese, was once a name spoken often in your household." Still, no reaction. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his tone still gentle. "A man presumed dead, a man whose likeness was preserved in a photograph your daughter kept hidden." The silence that followed was different than before. It was not empty, but filled, like a room into which air had suddenly rushed. Darnley closed his eyes. When he spoke, it was scarcely above a whisper. "Some truths," he said, "become unbearable, not because they are wrong, but because they are right, and come too late." That was all. As we took our leave, I found myself strangely reluctant to depart. There was something in the Colonel's bearing, so rigid, so composed, that invited not suspicion, but sorrow. He had not attempted to justify himself, nor to dissuade us. He had simply refused. Once we were beyond the gate, Holmes remained silent, but I could not. "He knew," I said, "not only of Reese, but of Eleanor's intentions." "He must have." Holmes gave a slight nod. "And yet he said nothing." "He still says nothing. He will never speak of it," Holmes replied, "because to do so would be—" "Father, I thought of Eleanor's words. She has chosen the path I could neither prevent nor abandon, and understood at last what they truly meant. He had allowed her to vanish, not with approval, not with joy, but with dignity. That evening, back at our lodgings, Holmes retrieved the original letter from Colonel Darnley. He laid it once more upon the desk, his fingers smoothing the creases as though recalling the weight of a moment that had passed too quickly. "She has chosen a path I could neither prevent nor abandon," he read aloud. He tapped the page lightly. "There is grief in those words, Watson, but also absolution. He could not prevent her from escaping a future she had not chosen. But he did not have the heart to stop her." I sat by the fire, the brandy warming in my glass, and found myself wondering not for the first time how many fathers had loved their daughters enough to let them disappear. The letter, short though it was, bore the cadence of farewell. Not from a man to a detective, but from a father to the only man he believed might one day understand. We sat in silence for a long while. The only sound that of the wind curling at the edges of the window pane. Then I spoke. Some fathers protect their daughters by speaking, I said. Others by remaining forever silent. Holmes said nothing at first. He rose and moved to the window where he stood looking out across the damp street. At last he nodded. Pride, when earned, is not diminished by sorrow, nor is mourning always expressed through grief. Sometimes, Watson, it wears the face of a man who says nothing, and in doing so says all. The lamp flickered slightly, and the room grew dimmer, though neither of us moved to trim the wick. Outside, the world continued without us. But within the quiet of that room, something had shifted. A truth had been reached, not spoken but known, and Holmes, who so often measured lives by what they revealed, allowed this one to remain defined by what it had withheld. It was just past the hour of 5 when a knock, sharp, urgent but respectful, broke the hush that had settled over our modest lodgings in Hartwood village. Holmes, who had been seated in rigid contemplation beside the hearth, stirred only slightly as the door opened to reveal a young constable, boots caked with clay and face flushed from haste. "Beg pardon, sir," the lad said, cap in hand. "There's been a further discovery at the estate." "Beneath the wreckage of the cellar stair, sir. It's another—" Well, it's not for me to say. Holmes rose without a word, his gaze sharpening like a blade drawn from scabbard. "Have they disturbed it?" "No, sir. Inspector Lestrade insisted it be left untouched until your arrival." "Quite right," Holmes murmured. "Watson, shall we?" And so we went out into the grey afternoon, the sound of those mud-stained boots still echoing behind us. The remnants of Hartwood House greeted us as before, solemn, still, and bitter with the smell of scorched timber. A temporary scaffold had been erected over the ruins, where Lestrade waited grimly with 2 uniformed men and a surgeon's assistant. He led us without preamble to a shallow cavity where the cellar staircase had once descended. There, amid the blackened debris and soot-covered bricks, lay a human form. Female in build, curled unnaturally upon itself, as if sheltering from heat that had come too swiftly. The face was beyond recognition. The hair had burned away entirely, yet the posture bore a strange deliberation, a quiet finality, more akin to repose than panic. Holmes knelt slowly, his eyes narrowing as he examined the scorched recess. "This position," he murmured, "is no accident of fire." Even Lestrade, ever the skeptic, did not contradict him. The air itself seemed to hush in reluctant agreement. As I bent nearer to assist Holmes in his examination, I noticed something incongruous upon the broken tiles just beside the corpse. A narrow golden band, untarnished by fire, resting gently upon a patch of grey ash. A wedding ring. "It was found thus?" Holmes inquired of Lestrade. "Exactly so. No attempt was made to place it on the hand, as you see," Lestrade replied. "It must have fallen off during the collapse." Holmes shook his head. "The flesh is unmarked," he said. "There is no indentation, no paling of the skin where a ring had ever been worn. This body did not die wearing it." I felt a slow chill creep into my bones, despite the lingering warmth of the ruined cellar. For the implications of such— Holmes leaned closer, his gloved fingers carefully lifting a piece of scorched wood from the corpse's side. "Observe," he said softly. "The body is placed against the stone in a protected alcove, not in the open." Not as one might fall in panic, I followed his gaze. Indeed, the limbs were oddly composed, the posture almost reverent. Not a single scrap of clothing bore the frantic tears or haphazard scalds one would expect in a fleeing victim. "No scream was heard from this chamber," Holmes continued. "No signs of struggle on the surrounding bricks. And the ring, placed near the hand but not on it, is too suggestive to be chance. Lestrade frowned. You mean someone meant for us to think that the body was Eleanor Darnley? Holmes finished calmly. And that she died here, alone, by fire. But she didn't, I asked quietly. Holmes's eyes did not waver. No, Watson. I believe she lived. By mid-afternoon, word had reached the surrounding village, and a quiet pall had settled over the townsfolk. Yet no one came forward to claim knowledge of the second body. No maid, housekeeper or seamstress had been reported missing, nor could any of the surviving staff identify the woman by her stature or fragments of clothing. She's not one of ours, said the elderly cook, who stood trembling by the cellar mouth, wringing her apron between twisted hands. I'd remember a girl with hair that fine. The constable nodded solemnly. We've checked the inn registries, the church ledgers, even the post. No woman unaccounted for. Holmes remained silent through this, his gaze fixed upon the body now carefully placed under canvas. His expression was neither mournful nor impassive, but one of calculation tempered with pity. We were, it seemed, in the presence of one whose name had been erased before it could be spoken. It was not until we returned briefly to the inn that Holmes permitted himself to voice what I had long begun to fear. She was a servant, he said, pouring a half measure of tea but drinking none of it. Likely hired under a false name. Close in age and build to Eleanor, and she died in that cellar, not by fate, but as a stand-in. I blinked. You mean Eleanor persuaded her to wear her dress? To wait in the cellar? Perhaps, for just a moment, Holmes replied. But the fire moved faster than any deception could be undone, and the note, drafted in Eleanor's hand, yes, but perhaps composed with another in mind. It reads like a farewell, yet offers no clarity, only symbolism. A cry for misdirection, not confession. The enormity of it struck me. One woman had died, but another, Eleanor, had disappeared, with the world believing her gone. That evening, long after the household had gone quiet and the embers of the drawing-room fire had faded to a dull orange glow, Holmes asked to see the household ledger, a meticulous volume kept by the butler, listing staff wages and entries. He studied its pages with care, finger tracing the neat copperplate lines. Then, quite suddenly, he paused. There, he said, tilting the book toward me. A name, M. Fleet, had been entered lightly in pencil, and then faintly struck through. The erasure was tentative, incomplete, as if the hand that made it lacked either the strength or the conviction to blot it out entirely. Who was she? I whispered. Holmes did not answer. But in the silence that followed, I saw in his eyes the quiet grief of one who knows the truth and respects the ghost of someone who had been sacrificed for another's escape. It was shortly after breakfast, as I perused the local paper with more mechanical attention than interest, that Holmes unfolded a yellow envelope with uncommon care. He examined it in silence for a long moment, then extracted a narrow slip of stiff paper. His eyes moved swiftly across the page, and a faint upward quirk touched his mouth. Well? I asked, noting the glint of satisfaction behind his calm demeanour. A message from an old acquaintance in Ghent, he said, encrypted but not unfamiliar. He passed me the note. The characters were arranged in irregular columns. A cipher, certainly, but one I did not immediately recognize. This isn't our usual German key. No, it was devised in Serbia during our Balkan affair of '94, Holmes replied. A cipher used only for communications of utmost discretion, which, in this case, is wholly warranted. He rose, already reaching for his coat. Come, Watson, the game, it seems, persists. We had not gone far along the village lane before Holmes paused beneath a quiet hawthorn tree and extracted the telegram again, now decoded and neatly annotated in his precise hand. "Note the alias," he said, pointing. "A woman using the name Mrs. Rees boarded the early train from Dover, entered Ghent before noon the day following the fire at Hartwood." I read the lines slowly. "So she lives." "She lives," Holmes confirmed, and more shrewdly than I expected. "The choice of Rees is curious, a rare enough name to be remembered, yet common enough to pass. A subtle hand. You believe it is Miss Darnley?" "I believe it is the woman who wrote the farewell note in the language of pressed flowers," Holmes replied quietly. "Wherever she goes, Watson, she travels not as a fugitive, but as a strategist." The morning mist stirred between us like breath held too long. We found Captain Langton alone in the drawing room of the inn that now served as temporary residence for those displaced by the fire. He stood at the window, one hand gripping the sill, the other holding an untouched tumbler of brandy. Holmes entered without preamble and with characteristic restraint offered a single statement. "Captain Langton, Eleanor Darnley crossed into Belgium 2 mornings ago." Langton turned sharply, the colour draining from his cheeks. "That's impossible," he said too quickly. "You're mistaken." Holmes made no reply. The silence pressed down like the lid of a box being shut. Langton's hand trembled. "You're certain of this?" "Certain enough to know she is no longer in England." For a moment, the room was utterly still, save for the faint ticking of a mantel clock. Then Langton set down the glass with a thud, his expression contorting with something that hovered between disbelief and rising agitation. "She deceived me," Langton muttered, pacing like a man cornered. "After all I risked, the arrangements, the disgrace endured for her, and now she runs like a thief in the night." I observed his features closely, the furrowed brow, clenched jaw, and tremulous hands. There was heat in his voice, yes, but no ache. "You seem more concerned with appearances, Captain, than with loss," Holmes remarked coldly. "Grief seldom demands such elaborate performance." Langton wheeled around. "Don't presume to lecture me, sir. I am a man betrayed." "Or perhaps unmasked," Holmes replied, folding his arms. The captain paled, his fury slipping into something more brittle. Apprehension, perhaps. He opened his mouth to speak, but faltered. It was clear now. What a lesser eye might read as wounded pride was to Holmes transparent fear. Not the sorrow of a jilted lover, but the dread of one whose secrets had outlived their silence. Holmes did not need to press further. Langton's defiance collapsed beneath the weight of implication. "She found the letters," he said hoarsely. "Buried in my campaign chest. Old, brittle things I thought forgotten." He sank into a chair, hands clasped between his knees. "There was a shipment of arms, diverted to a third party. My commanding officer turned a blind eye. Gold exchanged hands. It was wartime. The borders shifted daily. Who cared then?" "But Eleanor did," Holmes said quietly. Langton nodded, his voice a rasp. "She confronted me 3 weeks ago. Said she would go to the board, ruin my standing. She didn't understand it was survival. And now?" I tried to reason with her, to contain the matter. "By fire?" I asked, chilled. He met my gaze, hollow-eyed. "No, I never intended that. Only to persuade her. But she vanished, and the house burned. There was no affection in it," Langton continued, voice stripped of artifice. "Not from me, nor I suspect from her. She had no intention of marrying me. That became clear. But I needed her silence." He leaned forward, rubbing his temples. "I proposed under the guise of reconciliation. Offered sincerity I did not possess. I promised her a new start, redemption, even affection. It was all calculated. A campaign, not a courtship. Holmes watched him steadily. And yet she declined. Langton exhaled bitterly. She smiled and said she'd consider it. The next morning she was gone. That was the day before the fire, which, conveniently, removed any remaining witnesses, Holmes said. Langton did not protest. In his stillness was a kind of surrender. The charade had crumbled, leaving only the hollow architecture of a desperate man, whose honour had become a thing too fragile to bear scrutiny. Holmes stood at last and straightened his coat. "You need not fear the police, Captain. What you have confessed may well fall beyond their reach." Langton looked up, startled. "There are crimes," Holmes continued, "that the law cannot prosecute, and consequences it need not chase." He stepped toward the door. "But make no mistake, Eleanor's silence was never yours to purchase. And justice, Captain, has longer arms than any commission." He left without another word. Sitting room like dust in a library long undisturbed. Holmes, for once, made no immediate gesture toward tobacco or violin, but settled into his chair with a gravity I had not seen in him since the Langdale Valley business. He folded his hands upon his knee and regarded me with an expression not of triumph, but of burdened clarity. "Let us put our stones on the table, Watson," said he quietly, "one by one, and let them stand." And so began the slow laying out of fact. The ash beneath the stair, the ring beside an unmarked hand, the ledger name erased too softly to forget. Holmes spoke not with flourish, but with the careful cadence of a man who understands that truth, like stone, has weight, and must be placed precisely. "What we saw at Hartwood," Holmes continued, his gaze distant, "was not merely the aftermath of a fire, but the execution of a plan. Eleanor Darnley did not perish in that house. She walked away from it cloaked not in flames, but in the quiet anonymity of the forgotten." He explained how, days before the fire, Eleanor and her father had reached an understanding. She would disappear, not in disgrace, but in resolve, thus severing the chain Langton had fastened about her. With her father's failing strength and time running perilously thin, there remained but one solution. An escape, not through confrontation, but subterfuge. "Justice, Watson," Holmes murmured, "is not always pursued in the courts. Sometimes it is achieved by the simplest of arrangements, an exchanged name, a delayed telegram, a ring placed where none had ever been worn." "But what of the body?" I asked, the question tightening in my throat as I already feared the answer. Holmes's voice, though steady, betrayed a rare edge of regret. "The girl was named Alice Merrow, a maid of recent employ, young, slight, unbound by family. She was, by all accounts, quiet and easily led." It became clear that Alice had been persuaded, or perhaps coaxed by promises never meant to be kept, to don Eleanor's garments and remain below stairs, while the others retired. Whether she understood the full measure of the deception is unknowable, but she had been left behind. And when the blaze was kindled, her fate had been sealed, indistinguishable from the one she impersonated. Holmes bowed his head for a moment. "To die in another's name, Watson, is the cruelest irony of all." Holmes rose then and crossed to the fire, stirring it gently though no chill yet reached the room. Colonel Rees returned to Hartwood not to argue, but to protect. He entered that study, knowing Langton had discovered Eleanor's absence. There had been a confrontation. That much Holmes deduced from the soot-disturbed carpet and the smudged blood at the foot of the bookcase. Rees had challenged Langton, perhaps threatened exposure of past crimes or present intentions, and paid for it with his life. "And the fire?" I asked. "A match, Watson. A single match, struck not in panic, but in calculation, to conceal the truth and destroy the players. The fire was no accident of old wiring or coal stove negligence. It was Langton's desperate cleansing, his way of extinguishing all traces and nearly all memory. I sat in stillness as Holmes's words coalesced, forming a portrait at once tragic and noble. Colonel Darnley, a soldier to his marrow, had commanded battalions and brokered treaties, but in his final days he commanded one last campaign, the safeguarding of his daughter. Wounded though he was, the colonel coordinated every facet, from the falsified ring to the misdirected papers, Holmes observed. He gave the last flickers of his strength not to vengeance or defense, but to preservation. It was a father's final gesture, not one of possession but of protection. He had chosen obscurity over scandal for Eleanor, even if it meant silence forever. I confess, I looked away then, for my own father's voice echoed faintly in the recesses of my memory, and for once, Holmes did not speak. Holmes broke the silence at last. The ledger at Hartwood, the ash in the cellar, the telegram from Ghent, all of it adds up, and yet none of it must ever be presented. There are crimes, he said, that cannot be prosecuted without exposing the innocent. To unveil Langton's deeds would also unveil Eleanor's subterfuge, and with it, destroy the fragile sanctuary she now inhabited abroad. He turned to me with eyes that had seemed too much, and chosen, for once, to look away. Justice in this case lies not in retribution, but in its absence. She must remain dead to the world, if she is to live at all. I understood then, more keenly than I wished. This would not be one of our published accounts, nor a tale I would recount in clubs or letters. It would be instead one of those rare cases that lived only in Holmes's memory and my own, etched not in ink, but in the spaces between pages. We sat without speaking for some time. Then Holmes reached for his violin and drew from it a soft, wavering note that trembled as if uncertain it wished to be heard. The fire snapped once, and I closed the journal upon my knee. There are silences even London cannot break, and this, I believe, was one of them. It was during one of those rare lulls in activity at Baker Street that the Morning Post arrived with its customary rustle and clatter. Holmes, in dressing gown and slippers, sat immersed in a monograph on colonial poisons, while I busied myself with correspondence of a more domestic nature. Bills, a letter from my sister Clara, and a pamphlet on new surgical instruments. Among the ordinary stack, however, there lay one envelope that did not match the rest. It was of delicate cream paper, unembellished by address or return, save for a faint blue stamp at the upper right corner, an insignia I recognized as maritime in origin, though too worn to determine the vessel or port. Holmes, without looking up, said, "You've gone still, Watson. Something in the post?" "Yes," I murmured, handing him the envelope. "Something unusual." Holmes took the envelope in his long fingers and examined it in silence. He slit it open not with the impatience of curiosity, but with a kind of reverent caution, as one might open the page of a prayer book after many years. From within he drew 2 items. The first was a single slip of folded white paper, unmarked by pen or type. The second was a white rose, pressed flat, its petals yellowing faintly at the edges, fragile, as if carried through salt air and time. Holmes held the rose to the light, turning it slowly between finger and thumb. There was no message, no signature, no seal, only the quiet symbol of a thing that had once bloomed, now offered in silence. He placed the slip of paper upon his knee and did not open it. Without a word, Holmes rose and crossed the room to the narrow cabinet beside the mantel. From within it, he drew forth a long, narrow tin box, familiar to me, though rarely disturbed. It was a curious receptacle, half reliquary and half ashtray, into which Holmes had placed, over the years, a strange collection of items. Telegrams never replied to, shreds of evidence too volatile for police hands, and once, I believe, the corner of a bloodied handkerchief belonging to a man no longer spoken of. With careful fingers, he laid the rose and folded paper within, side by side. He closed the lid gently. "It is not always the evidence that bears weight," he said at last, "but the choice of where to keep it." I had watched him with quiet understanding. The ritual of the tin box was not one I ever interrupted, nor did I ask after its contents, save once, many years ago, when Holmes had refused even to speak for a full day after placing within it a child's toy soldier. But this time, something in the tenderness with which he had handled the rose stirred a question in me. Not a challenge, nor a demand. Only the voice of a friend who had stood at his side through rain, fire, and fog. "Do you believe," I asked gently, "that justice, in the end, was done?" Holmes did not look at me. His gaze remained fixed on the closed box, and the firelight danced faintly in the hollows of his cheek. "Justice," he said, "is a word overused by those who mistake order for righteousness." He turned then, slowly, and lowered himself into the armchair opposite mine. His voice bore no anger, only weariness, and something deeper still, perhaps a melancholy rarely allowed to surface. "There are cases," he continued, "in which truth is not served by exposure, where silence protects more surely than any verdict. And ash, Watson, ash is a final kind of truth. It cannot be reassembled or misquoted." I knew then that the fire at Hartwood and the secrets it had consumed would remain unspoken, and that Holmes, for all his devotion to reason and clarity, had chosen, in this rare case, to let the fog settle over facts best left in peace. As I reflected in silence upon his words, the pieces fell into quiet place within my own mind. Somewhere, far from Hartwood's scorched beams and the corridors that had once echoed with Langton's tread, a woman named Eleanor had taken another name. Perhaps she wore a simple gown, perhaps stood beside a man we had only glimpsed through smoke and rumour. There would be no register, no formal announcement, no choir or cathedral. And yet the envelope, the rose, the curling gently around the lamps and muffling the sound of hooves and footsteps below. He did not speak again, but I watched him, silhouette against the glass, and I thought how strange it was that in a life dedicated to unravelling truth, it was mercy, not knowledge, that drew his silence now. Some truths, I understood at last, vanish not from lack of proof, but because someone, somewhere, chose to let them go. We sat in silence for some time, the white rose still resting beside the hearth where Holmes had placed it. The lamplight caught the edge of his profile, all sharp angles and shadows, until he spoke. Not to me, but to the room. "Not all crimes beg for punishment, Watson. Some merely cry to be understood and left alone." He turned then, meeting my gaze. "The law seeks justice in black and white, but the truth, as you well know, resides most often in the grey. What do you think? Did Holmes act rightly in allowing the truth to remain hidden, or should he have brought Eleanor's secrets to light? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this quiet unravelling of justice, do like, subscribe, and share the story with fellow lovers of mystery. There are more shadows yet to explore.